Sometimes we judge too quickly, letting fear blind us to the goodness standing right before our eyes. We see the scars, the silence, the size of a man, and forget to look for his heart. In the trading village of Nordmark, a giant warrior named Kjarr stands in chains on the auction block. The villagers call him dangerous and want to sell him to the highest bidder. But when a small orphan girl runs from the crowd and throws her arms around him, crying, "Stop, he saved my life," everything changes. The crowd goes silent. They realize they may have been wrong about this quiet giant all along. What transforms a village's greatest fear into their most unlikely protector? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Nordmark's wooden walls like the breath of ancient spirits, reluctant to surrender the village to another day of commerce and compromise. Bjorn Ironhand had seen 43 such mornings since the first snow, and each one brought the same familiar ache in his bones, a reminder that even the strongest oak must eventually bow to winter's persistent touch. He stood at his workshop's threshold, weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of pine needle tea, watching the market square come alive with the purposeful bustle of traders and townsfolk. The scent of fresh bread from Astrid's bakery mingled with the sharper tang of leather and iron from the craftsman's stalls, creating that particular aroma that meant home to anyone who'd spent their years within these protective walls. "Another fine day for selling one's soul," muttered Orm the merchant, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd learned that survival often required choices that kept him awake at night. He emerged from his counting house, ledger tucked beneath. One arm, his once proud shoulders now curved like a question mark posed to an unforgiving world. Bjorn nodded, understanding the bitter truth behind his friend's words. Nordmark had always been a trading village. It was their strength, their salvation, their curse. Here, everything had a price, and everyone knew the cost of living too precisely. The Viking raids that had once brought both terror and prosperity to their region had dwindled to scattered skirmishes, leaving places like Nordmark to carve out existence through wit and commerce rather than sword and shield. "The slave trader arrives today," Orm continued, his voice dropping to the respectful whisper reserved for discussing necessary evils. "Magnus, the Red-Beard, brings fresh stock from the northern campaigns." The words settled between them like stones, dropped into still water, sending ripples of unease through the morning's peaceful routine. Both men understood what this meant. Another day of watching human beings reduced to cargo, of looking away while dignity was auctioned to the highest bidder. It was the price of peace, they told themselves. Better to trade in chains than to wear them. Across the square near the great oak that had sheltered Nordmark for more generations than anyone could count, a small figure darted between the market stalls with the fluid grace of water finding its way downhill. Elin Ravenshadow, though few knew her true surname, and fewer still dared speak it aloud, moved through the crowd like a ghost with substance, visible only when she chose to be seen. At 9 years old, she had already mastered the art of invisibility that kept orphans alive in a world that had little patience for children without protectors. Her dark hair hung in wild tangles that caught the morning light like a raven's wing, and her green eyes held depths that seemed far too ancient for such a young face. She wore cast-off clothing that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was more memory than material. Yet she carried herself with a dignity that no amount of poverty could diminish. Elin paused beside Freya's vegetable stand, her quick fingers liberating a small turnip while the older woman haggled with a customer over the price of winter onions. The girl's movements were swift and sure, not from greed, but from the simple mathematics of survival that every parentless child learned by heart. Eat today, worry about tomorrow when it arrives. "Little shadow," Freya called softly, not turning from her customer, but speaking just loud enough for Elin to hear. "There's day-old bread by the rain barrel. Help yourself." The kindness in the woman's voice brought a flush to Elin's cheeks, though she tried to hide it beneath a mask of fierce independence. She nodded once, a gesture that carried more gratitude than 1,000 words could express, and made her way to the mentioned bread with careful dignity intact. This was the delicate dance of Nordmark's unspoken charity, the way the village cared for its most vulnerable, without drawing attention to their need. Astrid might burn a loaf or two each week, always leaving them where hungry children could find them. Bjorn's workshop somehow always had scraps of leather suitable for patching worn shoes. The blacksmith's forge provided warmth for anyone seeking, shelter from the cold, no questions asked. They were small kindnesses in a harsh world, but they created the invisible threads that held their community together when everything else seemed determined to tear it apart. The sound of approaching hoofbeats and creaking wagon wheels announced the arrival that everyone had been expecting, yet secretly dreading. Magnus the Redbeard's trading caravan crested the hill overlooking Nordmark, a sight that never failed to command attention despite its grim cargo. Magnus himself rode at the head of the procession, a man whose reputation preceded him like storm clouds before rain. His beard had indeed earned its name, flowing red as autumn leaves down to his broad chest, though silver threads now wove through it like frost on copper. He wore prosperity like armor, fine furs, polished leather, rings of gold that caught the light with every gesture. Behind him rolled 3 massive wagons, their contents hidden beneath heavy canvas that couldn't quite muffle the soft clanking of chains. 23 souls this time, Magnus announced to Bjorn and the small crowd that had gathered to greet the caravan. His voice carried the casual tone of a man discussing livestock rather than human lives. Mostly strong backs from the northern settlements, good workers, the lot of them. Bjorn felt his stomach tighten at the trader's words, but he kept his expression neutral. This was business, he reminded himself. Unpleasant but necessary business that kept Nordmark prosperous and peaceful. The alternative, raiding, warfare, constant struggle, was far worse for everyone involved. Any special considerations? Asked Orm, stepping forward with his ledger already open. The merchant's practical mind was already calculating profits and expenses, though his heart remained carefully locked away from such considerations. 1, Magnus replied, his voice taking on a note of warning that made several villagers step back instinctively. The big one in the 3rd wagon calls himself Kjarr the Mountain, though I doubt that's his birth name. Found him half dead in a burned settlement up north. Fierce fighter, but he's been nothing but trouble since we shackled him. The trader's eyes grew distant, remembering. Lost 2 good men, trying to subdue him initially. Since then, he's barely spoken a word, just stares with those dark eyes like he's memorizing faces for later vengeance. The others are afraid of him, won't even sleep near his cage. Magnus paused, studying the faces around him with the calculating gaze of a man who'd learned to read people like weather patterns. I'm thinking 50 silver for him, given the risk. Maybe more if someone's feeling brave enough to take on the challenge of breaking him properly. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying implications that everyone understood but no one wanted to acknowledge. 50 silver was enough to feed a family for half a year, but it was also the price of purchasing someone's complete destruction of spirit. Elin, still clutching her rescued turnip and day-old bread, had moved closer to the crowd without anyone noticing. She had become expert at making herself small and invisible when adults discussed things that weren't meant for young ears. But something about this conversation sent cold fingers of dread crawling up her spine. The name, Kjarr the Mountain, meant something to her, though the memory remained frustratingly vague, like trying to recall a dream upon waking. There had been trees, she remembered, tall pines that whispered secrets in the wind, and eyes, kind eyes that had looked at her without judgment or calculation, and something about wolves. Best to keep him chained until after the sale, Magnus was saying. I've seen docile men turn violent when they catch scent of freedom, and this one was never docile to begin with. The trader signaled to his men, and the caravan began its slow procession into Nordmark's market square. The first two wagons contained what Magnus called his standard merchandise. Men and women whose spirits had already been broken by captivity, who moved with the resigned shuffle of those who had accepted their fate. They would be sold quietly, efficiently, to households and farms that needed extra hands for the coming season. But the third wagon drew every eye like a lodestone draws iron. Even covered by canvas and bound with extra chains, there was something about it that radiated danger and barely contained power. The horses pulling it seemed nervous, their ears laid back and nostrils flared as if they could smell something that troubled their prey animal instincts. When Magnus's men finally drew back the canvas to reveal the wagon's contents, a collective intake of breath swept through the gathered crowd. There, hunched as much as the low ceiling would allow, sat a figure that seemed carved from legend itself. Kjarr the mountain was aptly named. Even seated and chained, he towered above the other, captives like an oak among saplings. His shoulders spanned the width of a doorframe, and his arms bore the thick muscle of a man who had spent his life wielding heavy weapons with deadly precision. Long, dark hair, streaked with premature silver, hung like a curtain around a face that might have been handsome before it was marked by violence and suffering. But it was his eyes that truly commanded attention. Dark as storm clouds, filled with an intelligence that captivity had not dimmed, and a sorrow that spoke of losses too great for tears. They swept across the crowd with careful assessment, noting faces, measuring threats, calculating possibilities with the methodical precision of a master strategist. Multiple chains bound him to the wagon's frame, around his wrists, his ankles, his waist. The iron had rubbed his skin raw in places, leaving marks that spoke of long struggle and gradual acceptance. Yet despite his bonds, despite his obvious exhaustion, there remained something unbroken about him that made even the bravest villagers step back when his gaze fell upon them. "As you can see," Magnus said, with the practiced ease of a man who had conducted such exhibitions countless times, "he's quite impressive. Strong enough to do the work of 3 normal men, if properly motivated. The scars tell stories of survival that most men couldn't claim. Indeed, Kjarr's visible skin bore the map of a violent life, sword cuts, spear wounds, burn marks from battles fought and survived. Each mark told a story of someone who had faced death repeatedly and emerged victorious, until the day when numbers and exhaustion had finally overwhelmed even his formidable skills. "What's his crime?" called out Eric the blacksmith, a man whose own scarred hands knew something about the weight of iron and the cost of strength. Magnus shrugged with elaborate indifference. "Depends who you ask. Some say he burned a village to the ground in a fit of rage. Others claim he murdered a chieftain's son over a gambling debt. Still others whisper he's cursed by the gods themselves, bringing misfortune to any who shelter him." The trader's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried clearly to every listening ear. "Truth is, I don't much care what he did before. All that matters is what he's worth now, and what someone's willing to pay for." The privilege of owning all that strength and fury. From her position at the edge of the crowd, Elin felt something stir in her memory, like embers being blown back to life. Those eyes, she had seen them before, in a context that had nothing to do with chains and auction blocks. They had been kind then, concerned, protective rather than dangerous, but the memory remained frustratingly incomplete, like trying to grasp water with her fingers. All she could recall was a sense of safety, of being shielded from something terrible by someone, impossibly large and gentle, and the conviction, growing stronger with each passing moment, that whatever crimes this man might have committed, they did not include the casual cruelty that marked true monsters. The crowd began to disperse as Magnus's men prepared the auction, block, and arrange their human merchandise for display. It would be several hours before the actual bidding began, giving potential buyers time to examine their options and calculate their investments. But Elin remained, her small form now the only observer as Kjarr the Mountain sat in his chains, staring at nothing with those haunted dark eyes. She studied his face, searching for the key that would unlock the memories dancing just beyond her reach, and somewhere in the deepest part of her young heart, she began to understand that when the auction started, she would have to do something that might be very brave or very foolish, but was certainly necessary, because sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truths, and sometimes the most important stand we make is the one that costs us everything. The auction block stood in the center of Nordmark's market square like an altar to commerce and compromise, its worn wooden surface polished smooth by countless transactions that had reduced human dignity to silver coins. By midday, when the sun hung directly overhead casting sharp shadows between the gathered buildings, nearly every adult in the village had found reasons to be present for Magnus's sale. They came with purses jingling and consciences carefully tucked away, telling themselves stories about practical necessity and economic survival. The baker needed strong hands for the heavy grain sacks. The blacksmith required assistance with the larger forge work. The farmers faced another harsh winter and needed help preparing their holdings for the season ahead, all perfectly reasonable. Justifications for participating in what everyone knew was an unreasonable business. Magnus, the Redbeard, had arranged his merchandise with the practiced eye of a man who understood presentation's role in profit. The more compliant captives stood in loose formation beside the auction block, their chains just visible enough to remind potential buyers of ownership while not so prominent as to suggest ongoing rebellion. Most kept their eyes downcast, having learned that meeting the gaze of free men often brought unwanted attention and harsher treatment. But Kjarr the Mountain remained apart from the others, still secured in his wagon like a caged bear that everyone feared might break free at any moment. Even from a distance, his presence dominated the square with an intensity that made conversations quieter and movements more cautious. Elin had positioned herself behind Astrid's bread stall, close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid, being noticed by adults whose attention might prove unwelcome. Her small hands gripped the wooden counter's edge as she watched the proceedings with growing anxiety, the incomplete memories in her mind becoming more insistent with each passing moment. "Ladies and gentlemen of Nordmark," Magnus announced, his voice carrying the false joviality of a man who had learned to make darkness sound appealing. "Today, I bring you opportunity disguised as necessity. Strong backs, willing hands, loyal service, all for prices that would make the merchants in the southern cities weep with envy." The crowd murmured appreciatively, though Elin noticed how many of the villagers avoided looking directly at the people being offered for sale. It was easier to participate in such transactions when you focused on the practical benefits rather than the human costs. The first few sales proceeded smoothly. A young woman with calloused hands went to Eric the blacksmith for 20 silver, her obvious skill with metalwork making her a valuable addition to his forge. Two brothers, captured from the same raided settlement, were purchased together by old Henrik for his farm, a mercy that Magnus granted more from practicality than kindness, as their combined price exceeded what either would have brought individually. Each transaction followed the same ritual. Magnus would present the merchandise with practiced enthusiasm, highlighting strengths and minimizing weaknesses like a horse trader at a county fair. Potential buyers would inspect their prospective purchases with varying degrees of consideration or callousness. Silver would change hands, ownership would transfer, and another human being would learn their new place in the world's harsh mathematics. Through it all, Elin watched Kjarr the Mountain, and he watched everything else. Even chained in his wagon, he seemed to catalogue every face, every gesture, every word spoken. His dark eyes missed nothing, and she could see the intelligence working behind them, calculating odds, measuring distances, analyzing weaknesses in a way that suggested he had not yet accepted his fate as permanently as his captors believed. And now, Magnus announced as the standard merchandise dwindled to its final few pieces, we come to the crown jewel of today's offerings. Gentlemen, I present Kjarr the Mountain, warrior, survivor, and quite possibly the strongest man you'll ever have the opportunity to own. Two of Magnus's guards approached the wagon with obvious reluctance, their hands resting on their sword hilts, more from nervousness than any real expectation of trouble. They had learned to respect the chained giant's capacity for violence, even in his current restrained state. Careful with those locks, lads, Magnus called cheerfully. We want him able to demonstrate his value, but not so free that he decides to renegotiate the terms of his captivity. The guards unlocked the wagon's rear gate and stepped quickly aside as Kjarr slowly, painfully, extracted himself from the cramped confines. Even bound by chains, his emergence was like watching a mountain decide to walk, impressive and somehow terrible in its implications. Standing at his full height for the first time since arriving in Nordmark, Kjarr towered over everyone present, by at least a head and shoulders. The chains that held him had been forged for smaller men, and they strained visibly against his frame when he moved. His legs, cramped from long confinement, trembled slightly as he found his balance, but his expression remained impassive as carved stone. 7 feet of pure muscle and determination. Magnus continued his sales presentation, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Even he seemed affected by the giant's imposing presence. Skilled with axe, sword, and bare hands, proven in battle, tested by adversity, ready to serve whoever has the wisdom to invest in his potential. The crowd had grown noticeably quieter as Kjarr stood there, his dark eyes sweeping across the assembled faces with an intensity that made several villagers step backward involuntarily. There was something about his silence that felt more threatening than any roared challenge might have been, the quiet of a predator calculating the best moment to strike. "What guarantee do we have that he won't murder us in our sleep?" called out Gunnar the Tanner, voicing the concern that occupied every mind present. Magnus laughed, though the sound carried less conviction than his words suggested. "He's broken, friend Gunnar. Oh, he may still look dangerous, but 3 months of proper persuasion have taught him the futility of resistance. Haven't they, giant?" He turned to Kjarr expectantly, clearly hoping for some display of submission that would reassure potential buyers. Instead, the chained warrior continued his silent survey of the crowd, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts or intentions. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Magnus cleared his throat and continued. "As you can see, he's learned the wisdom of keeping his own counsel. No more threats, no more struggles, just quiet acceptance of his circumstances." But Elin could see what the adults missed, blinded as they were by their own fears and prejudices. She saw the way Kjarr's eyes softened almost imperceptibly when they passed over the other captives still awaiting sale. She noticed how he shifted his weight to favor his left leg, suggesting an injury he was trying to hide from potential buyers who might use such weakness to negotiate a lower price. Most importantly, she observed the careful way he tested his chains without appearing to do so, not the actions of a broken man, but of one biding his time. "Bidding starts at 30 silver, Magnus announced, his voice regaining some of its earlier enthusiasm. Surely someone here recognizes the value of owning such magnificent strength. The crowd exchanged uncertain glances. 30 silver was a substantial sum, representing months of careful saving for most families. And while Kjarr's physical capabilities were undeniable, his potential for violence made him a dangerous investment that could easily prove fatal to an unwary owner. 25, offered Thorvald the mine owner, a hard man who worked dangerous depths and understood the value of intimidating size when dealing with unruly workers. 30, Magnus repeated firmly. I have transport costs to consider, gentlemen. Feeding a man his size for 3 months doesn't come cheaply. 28, countered Harold the merchant, who had been eyeing Kjarr with the calculating gaze of someone imagining the profits that could be extracted from such impressive physical capabilities. As the bidding slowly climbed toward Magnus's asking price, Elin felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The memory she had been chasing finally broke free from the shadows of her mind, arriving with the sudden clarity of lightning illuminating a dark landscape. She remembered now. The wolves, a pack of them, hungry and desperate in the depths of last winter's worst storm. She had been gathering firewood in the forest north of Nordmark when they had found her scent and begun their patient, terrifying pursuit. She remembered running, stumbling, falling in the deep snow while yellow eyes watched from between the trees, and then he had appeared, this same gentle giant who now stood in chains before a jeering crowd. He had stepped between her and the pack with nothing but a hunting knife and the kind of calm courage that comes from a life spent protecting things smaller and more vulnerable than oneself. The wolves had sensed something in him that made them reconsider their hunting plans, and they had melted back into the forest like shadows fleeing from light. He had walked her back to the village's edge without saying a word, then disappeared into the wilderness like a guardian spirit, returning to whatever realm such beings inhabited when their work was done. She had tried to tell people about her mysterious savior, but the adults had dismissed her story as the imagination of a frightened child embellishing a lucky escape. Now that same protector stood before them in chains, about to be sold like livestock, to men who saw only his potential for labor and violence. 35 silver, Magnus was saying, his satisfaction evident as the bidding finally reached profitable levels. Do I hear 40? The moment had arrived when Elin knew she could remain silent no longer. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to avoid drawing adult attention that could bring its own dangers. But the memory of kind eyes and selfless protection demanded something from her that was larger than fear or self-preservation. She stepped out from behind the bread stall, her small form suddenly visible to the entire crowd as she walked toward the auction block with determined steps. Conversations faltered as people noticed the wild-haired orphan girl making her way through the press of bodies with unusual purpose. 40 silver, Harold was saying, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed his victory was assured. Stop! Elin's voice cut through the market square's noise like a blade through silk, high and clear, and filled with the kind of absolute conviction that can only come from a child's uncompromising sense of right and wrong. Every head turned toward her as she broke into a run, her small legs carrying her toward the giant warrior with reckless determination. The crowd parted before her, too surprised by her sudden appearance to react quickly enough to stop her progress. "Stop!" she cried again, throwing herself against Kjarr's chained legs with the full force of her small body, her thin arms wrapped around him as far as they could reach while tears streamed down her face. "He saved my life!" The market square fell silent as if struck by some divine hand, every conversation stopping mid-word as the significance of the little girl's desperate plea settled over the assembled crowd like a heavy blanket. The silence that followed Elin's desperate cry stretched across Nordmark's market square, like ice forming over still water, fragile, crystalline, and pregnant with the possibility of shattering at the slightest disturbance. Every face in the crowd wore the expression of someone who had just witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they understood about the world. Magnus the Redbeard was the first to break the spell, his merchant's instincts overriding his surprise as he stepped forward with forced joviality. "Now, little one, you shouldn't be—" "He saved me from the wolves," Elin continued, her voice trembling but determined as she pressed her face against Kjarr's leg. "In the northern woods, when the pack was hunting me, he stepped between us with nothing but a knife and made them go away." She looked up at the giant warrior, her green eyes bright with tears and fierce loyalty. You remember, don't you? It was snowing and I was so scared, and you walked me back to safety without asking for anything in return. For the first time since arriving in Nordmark, Kjarr's impassive expression shifted almost imperceptibly. His dark eyes, which had remained carefully neutral throughout his captivity and the morning's degrading auction, softened as they looked down at the small figure clinging to his chains. The change was subtle, a slight relaxation around his eyes, a barely perceptible nod. But to those watching closely, it was like seeing a statue suddenly draw breath. "The child is confused," Magnus said quickly, his voice taking on the practiced smoothness of a man who had learned to talk his way past inconvenient complications. "Trauma can play tricks with memory, especially in one so young. She's probably thinking of some other large man, perhaps a village guard or traveling merchant. But Bjorn Ironhand had spent enough years reading faces to recognize truth when he saw it. And what he saw in both the girl's desperate sincerity and the giant's subtle acknowledgement was something that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Let her speak," he said quietly, his weathered voice carrying an authority that came from respected craftsmanship rather than political position. The crowd murmured uncertainly, caught between their desire to dismiss the child's claims and their growing recognition that something significant was occurring before their eyes. These were people who had learned to navigate life's complexities through careful observation and practical wisdom, and many of them were beginning to sense that their assumptions about the chained warrior might have been dangerously incomplete. Elin drew strength from Bjorn's supportive words, wiping her nose on her sleeve before continuing with the earnest precision that only children possessed when telling stories they knew to be absolutely true. "It was 3 months ago, just before the first big snow. I was collecting kindling beyond the stone markers because the wood closer to town was already picked clean." Her voice grew stronger as the memories solidified in her mind, details emerging, with the clarity that comes from events seared into consciousness by extreme emotion. "The wolves found my trail and started following me. There were 6 of them, maybe 7. I was too scared to count properly. They kept pace with me for what felt like hours, always just visible through the trees." Several villagers nodded knowingly. The wolf packs had indeed been unusually bold that winter, driven closer to human settlements by the harsh weather and dwindling prey. More than one hunting party had returned with stories of narrow escapes and calculated retreats. "When I finally stumbled and fell in a drift, they started closing in," Elin continued, her small hands unconsciously tightening their grip on Kjarr's leg. "I thought that was the end. I could see their yellow eyes and hear their breathing. And I knew I was going to die alone in the snow." The market square had grown so quiet that her soft voice carried clearly to every listener, and more than one parent felt their heart clench at the image of this small, fierce child facing such terror in the wilderness. "But then he appeared," she said, looking up at Kjarr with an expression that mixed gratitude and protective loyalty in equal measure. "He just stepped out from behind a tree like he'd been waiting there the whole time. He was carrying a hunting knife and an axe, but he didn't threaten the wolves or try to scare them with noise." She paused, remembering, her young mind working to find words for something that had transcended ordinary experience. "He just stood there between us, completely still and calm, and somehow the wolves knew they didn't want to test him. They watched him for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the forest, like smoke." Magnus shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that the child's story was having an effect on his potential customers that threatened to complicate his sale considerably. "Even if true," he interjected, "one act of whatever this was doesn't change the man's fundamental nature. He was captured for good reasons, and those reasons haven't disappeared because a child has fond memories." But Orm the merchant, whose ledger-keeping mind had caught something important, stepped forward with a thoughtful expression. 3 months ago, you said? That would have been just before Magnus found him half dead in that burned settlement up and north. The timing hung in the air like an unspoken question, and several villagers began performing their own mental calculations. If Kjarr had been helping lost children in the woods, what had led to his capture just days later? The accepted story that he was a dangerous criminal subdued after committing some terrible crime suddenly seemed less certain. "Tell them about afterward," Bjorn encouraged Elin gently, sensing that there was more to her story that might shed light on their current dilemma. Elin nodded gratefully, her confidence growing as she realized that at least some of the adults were truly listening, rather than simply waiting for her to finish speaking so they could dismiss her words. "He walked with me all the way back to the village boundary," she said. "He didn't talk, but he kept checking to make sure I was warm enough and wasn't falling behind. When we reached the stone markers, he knelt down so we were eye to eye." She looked around the crowd, making sure they understood the significance of what she was about to reveal. "He took off his own cloak, this beautiful fur-lined thing that must have been worth more silver than most of us see in a year, and wrapped it around my shoulders. Then he pointed toward the village lights and nodded once, like he was saying, 'You're safe now.' The image of the giant warrior kneeling to comfort a frightened child, sacrificing his own warmth for her protection, created a cognitive dissonance that several villagers were visibly struggling to reconcile with their preconceptions about dangerous criminals and broken slaves. When I tried to return the cloak, he shook his head and stepped back into the forest," Elin concluded. "I never saw him again until today, but I never forgot his kindness, and I never forgot that when someone needed protecting, he didn't hesitate to put himself at risk for a stranger." The crowd exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence in Magnus's characterization of his merchandise beginning to waver like candle flames in a draught. Harold the merchant, who had been so eager to claim his 40 silver prize, now looked distinctly less certain about the wisdom of owning someone whose true nature might be fundamentally different from what they had been led to believe. But it was Astrid the baker who voiced what many were thinking, her flour-dusted hands folded across her ample chest as she studied Kjarr with new eyes. "If the child speaks truth," she said slowly, "then perhaps we've been asking the wrong questions about this man. Instead of wondering what crimes he might have committed, maybe we should be asking what happened to someone who risks his life. Protecting lost children." The suggestion hung in the air like morning mist, subtle but transformative, beginning to change the very nature of the conversation taking place around the auction block. The transformation rippling through the crowd was almost visible, like watching wheat bend before an approaching storm. Where moments before there had been calculated assessments of livestock value, now there was something far more complex. The uncomfortable recognition that they might have been participants in something that violated their deepest understanding of right and wrong. Magnus sensed the shift immediately, his merchant's instincts screaming warnings about lost profits and complicated situations. "Friends," he said, raising his voice with practiced authority, "we mustn't let sentiment cloud our judgment here. Whatever kindness this man may have shown in the past, he was captured for legitimate reasons by legitimate authorities." He gestured toward Kjarr with theatrical dismissiveness. "Look at him. Those scars didn't come from helping children across streams or rescuing cats from trees. This is a warrior, a killer, someone who has taken lives in numbers we can only imagine. One act of mercy doesn't erase a lifetime of violence." But even as Magnus spoke, something was happening that no amount of salesmanship could counteract. Kjarr himself was changing before their eyes, the subtle transformation that had begun when he looked down at Elin, continuing to unfold like a flower opening to unexpected sunlight. The rigid tension that had held his massive frame like drawn bowstrings was gradually relaxing. His breathing, which had been carefully controlled and shallow throughout his captivity, deepened into something more natural. Most remarkably, his eyes, those dark, haunted depths that had seemed to catalogue threats and calculate vengeance, now held something approaching warmth as they remained fixed on the small girl still clinging to his leg. Freya, the vegetable seller, stepped forward, her weathered face thoughtful as she studied the scene. "Magnus," she said carefully, "if I may ask, what exactly were these legitimate authorities you mention, and what specific crimes was this man accused of committing?" The question hung in the air with deceptive simplicity, but its implications cut straight to the heart of the matter. Magnus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he recognized the trap hidden within what appeared to be mere curiosity. "The details are complex," he said, his earlier confidence wavering slightly. "Border disputes, questions of allegiance, the usual complications that arise when settlements change hands in times of conflict." Orm looked up from his ledger with the sharp attention of a man whose livelihood depended on accurate information. "That's rather vague, friend Magnus. Surely, the authorities provided you with specific charges, documentation, some form of legal justification for removing a man from his home and selling him like cattle." The silence that followed Orm's questions was different from the earlier shocked quiet. This was the focused attention of people who were beginning to ask the kinds of questions they should have posed from the beginning. Magnus shifted uncomfortably, his rings catching the sunlight as his hands moved in small, nervous gestures. "The Northern Territories are in chaos," he said finally. "Sometimes survival requires making difficult decisions without the luxury of formal legal proceedings. This man was found among the ruins of a settlement that had been burned to the ground. What conclusions would you draw from such evidence?" "That he might have been defending it," Bjorn said quietly, his craftsman's logic cutting through Magnus's carefully constructed implications. "Or that he arrived too late to save it, or that he was the sole survivor of an attack by others." "The blacksmith," Eric nodded slowly, his own scarred hands understanding something about the weight of violence carried by those who had been forced to use it. "A man doesn't acquire scars like those from attacking the innocent," he observed. "Those are defensive wounds, earned protecting something or someone." As if responding to their words, Kjarr slowly, carefully, lowered himself to one knee, a movement that sent visible tension through Magnus's guards but brought him closer to Elin's eye level. The chains binding him clanked softly with the motion, a sound that seemed somehow obscene in the context of his obvious gentleness toward the child. "You kept the cloak," he said, his voice emerging like distant thunder, deep, measured, and carrying the weight of genuine emotion. These were the first words anyone had heard him speak since his arrival in Nordmark, and they were directed not at his captors or potential buyers, but at the small girl who had risked everything to defend him. Elin nodded eagerly, tears streaming down her face as she pulled something from beneath her patched tunic. The fur-lined cloak, carefully folded and preserved despite her otherwise ragged appearance, emerged like a relic from a more honorable time. "I kept it safe," she whispered. "I knew someday I'd be able to return it to you." The sight of the expensive cloak in the orphan child's possession sent another ripple of recognition through the crowd. Here was physical proof of Kjarr's sacrifice, tangible evidence that his kindness toward Elin had been real, rather than imagined. Magnus was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable as his carefully orchestrated sale dissolved into something he could no longer control. "The past is the past," he said with forced joviality. "What matters now is practical consideration. I have transport costs, feeding expenses, the wages of my guards to consider. Surely we can conclude this business in a manner that benefits everyone." But Harold the merchant, who had been so eager to claim his prize just minutes earlier, now stepped back from the auction block with visible uncertainty. "I find myself reconsidering," he said slowly. "The purchase of a man requires certain assumptions about his character and circumstances. If those assumptions prove incorrect, the assumptions remain valid, Magnus interrupted, his voice taking on a harder edge as he sensed his profitable transaction slipping away. This man was captured in circumstances that strongly suggest criminal activity. One child's testimony cannot outweigh the judgment of proper authorities. What authorities? Astrid asked pointedly. You've mentioned them several times, but you've provided no names, no official documentation, no verification of your claims. The baker's question exposed the fundamental weakness in Magnus's position, and several villagers were beginning to look at the trader with the kind of suspicion previously reserved for his merchandise. Thorvald, the mine owner, a man whose dangerous profession had taught him to read character quickly and accurately, crossed his arms over his broad chest. I've worked with violent men, Magnus. Men who kill for profit, men who enjoy causing pain, men who see others as obstacles to be removed. This one, he gestured toward Kjarr, doesn't carry himself like that kind of killer. How a man carries himself means nothing, Magnus protested, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. It means everything, Eric countered. Violence leaves marks on a man's soul as surely as it leaves scars on his body. This one has known violence, yes, but as defender, not aggressor. As the villagers continued their questioning, Elin had quietly moved closer to Kjarr, her small hand coming to rest on one of his massive chained ones. The gesture was simple, natural, unafraid, the kind of instinctive trust that children showed only to those they recognized as protectors rather than predators. And in that moment, watching a small orphan girl offer comfort to a giant warrior in chains, the people of Nordmark began to understand that they were witnessing something that challenged not just their assumptions about one man, but their entire understanding of justice, compassion, and the courage required to do what was right, even when it came at personal cost. The auction had become something else entirely, a trial not of Kjarr's character, but of their own moral courage when faced with truth that demanded action. The morning sun had reached its zenith, casting short shadows beneath the feet of the crowd that no longer resembled an audience at a slave auction. Instead, they had become something more complex, a jury of peers grappling with questions that cut to the heart of their community's values and their own complicity in systems they had never properly examined. Magnus the Redbeard found himself in the increasingly uncomfortable position of a man whose carefully constructed narrative was unraveling thread by thread. His remaining guards had moved closer to his position, their hands resting on weapon hilts more from nervous habit than any real expectation of violence. Yet even they seemed affected by the change in atmosphere, their earlier casual confidence replaced by something approaching uncertainty. Perhaps, suggested Freya, with the diplomatic caution of someone who had learned to navigate village politics through decades of careful observation, we should hear more of this man's own story before proceeding with any transactions. She looked directly at Kjarr, her weathered face showing the kind of maternal concern that came naturally to women who had spent their lives caring for others. You have a voice, large one. Would you share what brought you to these circumstances? For a long moment, Kjarr remained silent, his dark eyes moving slowly across the assembled faces, as if measuring the sincerity of their interest against the probability of betrayal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had grown accustomed to being misunderstood and misrepresented. 3 months passed, he began, his words measured and careful. I served as guardian to the settlement of Ironbrook, a small community in the northern reaches where the mountains meet the tundra. 50 souls, including children, elders, and those who sought peace rather than glory. His voice held the deep timbre of someone accustomed to command, but also a gentleness that suggested his authority had been earned through protection rather than intimidation. We had no walls, no great defenses. Our strength lay in being too small to attract attention and too remote to be worth the effort of conquest. Elin pressed closer to his side, her small presence seeming to give him strength to continue with what was clearly a painful recounting. The raiders came at dawn, Kjarr continued, his eyes growing distant with memory. 30 men, well armed and seeking slaves and plunder. They expected easy prey, farmers and fishermen, perhaps a few older. Warriors past their prime. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They were not entirely wrong. Most of our people were indeed peaceful folk who had chosen isolation over conflict, but they had forgotten that even sheep require shepherds when wolves come calling. Magnus shifted uncomfortably, beginning to sense where this narrative might lead and how it could further complicate his increasingly difficult sail. I held them at the settlement's edge for 3 hours, Kjarr said simply, as if describing the completion of some routine task, rather than what had clearly been an epic stand against overwhelming odds. Long enough for our people to evacuate. Through the mountain passes, carrying what they could and leading the livestock to safety. Eric the blacksmith nodded with professional respect. 1 man against 30, that's how you earned those scars. Some of them, Kjarr acknowledged. When the fighting was finished, 22 of the raiders lay dead, and 8 had fled back toward whatever hole had spawned them. But the settlement itself was lost. They had set fires before the final assault, ensuring that even if I succeeded in driving them off, there would be nothing left to defend. The implications of his story settled over the crowd like morning mist, gradually revealing a landscape far different from what Magnus had painted. Here was not a criminal or deserter, but a guardian who had sacrificed everything, his home, his community, his freedom, to protect those entrusted to his care. You were wounded in this battle, Astrid asked gently, her baker's eye noting the way he favored his left side, despite his obvious strength. Severely, Kjarr admitted. Blood. Loss, exhaustion, a spear thrust that should have been mortal, if not for the grace of the gods. I collapsed among the ruins and expected to die there, which seemed fitting enough, a guardian's last duty fulfilled in the place he had failed to save. But instead, Magnus found you, Orm observed, his merchant's mind already calculating the moral mathematics of what they had just learned. Kjarr's expression hardened slightly as his gaze settled on the trader. He found me 3 days later, barely conscious and half-mad with fever. His first questions were not about my condition or my needs, but about whether anyone would come searching for me, whether I had family or allies who might demand my return. The crowd's attention shifted toward Magnus, who was beginning to look distinctly pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. You must understand, the trader said quickly. A wounded man alone among ruins, surrounded by dead bodies. What was I to think? The evidence suggested that you saw an opportunity to profit from someone else's tragedy, Bjorn interrupted, his craftsman's honesty cutting through Magnus's rationalizations with surgical precision. You found a dying hero and saw a valuable slave. Magnus's remaining composure cracked slightly. I'm a businessman, not a charity organization. I cannot afford to investigate every hard luck story or verify every claim of innocence. There are costs, risks, practical considerations, and there are moral considerations, Freya said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never confused profitable with proper. When you shackle a man who has sacrificed everything to protect the innocent, you become complicit in injustice regardless of your motivations. The village's mood had shifted from curiosity to something approaching anger, though it was a controlled, thoughtful anger that suggested they were learning to direct their outrage toward appropriate targets. They were beginning to understand that they had been manipulated, not just misled about one man's character, but convinced to participate in a transaction that violated their deepest values. Young Sigrid, Eric's daughter, who had been quietly listening from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward with the kind of moral clarity that sometimes emerged from those too young to have learned the compromises that adulthood seemed to require. "If what he says is true," she said in a clear voice that carried despite her youth, "then we're not witnessing a slave auction. We're watching a hero being sold for the crime of succeeding too well at protecting those who couldn't protect themselves." Her words struck the gathering like hammer blows on an anvil, shaping something hard and unforgiving from the raw material of their growing understanding. The child's simple logic exposed the fundamental obscenity of their situation in terms that no amount of adult rationalization could soften. Magnus was now visibly sweating despite the cool mountain air. "You have only his word for these claims," he protested. "Slaves often invent noble histories to improve their circumstances. Without verification, we have more than his word," Elin said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the trader's desperation with surprising strength. "We have the truth of who he is, shown through his actions. He saved my life when he had nothing to gain, and everything to lose. That's not the behavior of someone who preys on the innocent." She looked up at Kjarr with fierce loyalty burning in her green eyes. "And we have his character, proven not through words, but through the fact that even in chains, even after months of abuse, his first concern was making sure I had kept safe the gift he gave me." The crowd fell silent again, but this time the silence held something different, not shock or confusion, but the gathering force of collective moral awakening. They were no longer witnesses to a commercial transaction, but participants in a moment that would define their community's character for years to come. The weight of moral reckoning settled over Nordmark's market square like snow accumulating on branches, silent, inexorable, and carrying the potential to break whatever could not bear its burden. Magnus the Redbeard found himself in the uncomfortable position of a man whose livelihood depended on others' willingness to look away from inconvenient truths, now facing a community that had suddenly decided to examine those truths with uncomfortable clarity. "Even if we accept this version of events," Magnus said, his voice taking on the desperate edge of someone watching profitable certainties dissolve into expensive complications, "the fundamental situation remains unchanged. I have legal possession of this man, acquired through proper channels with appropriate documentation." Orm looked up from his ledger with the sharp attention that came from years of scrutinizing commercial claims. "Then perhaps you could share this documentation with us? Bills of sale, transfer papers, official writs. Surely a transaction of this magnitude would require substantial paperwork." The request hung in the air with deceptive simplicity, but everyone present understood its implications. In their world, legitimate business was always accompanied by careful record-keeping. Only the darkest trades relied solely on handshake agreements and unspoken understandings. Magnus's hand moved instinctively toward a leather satchel at his side, then stopped as if encountering some invisible barrier. "The documents are back with my main caravan. Security precautions, you understand. Valuable papers shouldn't be carried unnecessarily into potentially volatile situations." His explanation satisfied no one, least of all Bjorn, whose honest craftsmanship had taught him to recognize the difference between authentic work and clever forgery. "Convenient," the smith observed dryly, "though I find it curious that a man would transport valuable merchandise without the papers that prove his right to sell them. Unless," Eric added, with the practical insight of someone who understood how questionable goods moved through grey markets, "those papers don't actually exist or wouldn't bear close inspection if they did." Magnus's composure was cracking like ice under spring pressure, revealing something uglier beneath his merchant's pleasant facade. "You're questioning my integrity based on the sob story of a captured warrior and the imagination of a child," he said, his voice hardening with frustrated anger. "This is how profitable partnerships die, through sentimental foolishness that values feelings over facts." But even as he spoke, something else was happening that threatened to make his commercial concerns irrelevant. Kjarr had been watching the exchange with growing intensity, his dark eyes fixed not on Magnus or the villagers, but on something that had caught his attention among the trader's remaining guards. One of those guards, a lean, scarred man who had remained silent throughout the morning's proceedings, wore something that made Kjarr's massive frame go rigid with sudden tension. Hanging from the guard's belt, almost concealed among his other weapons and equipment, was a small bronze medallion that caught the sunlight with familiar gleam. "You," Kjarr said suddenly, his voice carrying a new quality that made everyone present instinctively step back. It was not anger exactly, but something deeper and more dangerous, the focused attention of a predator that had just identified its prey. The guard looked up with guilty surprise, his hand moving reflexively toward the medallion as if to hide it from view. But the motion only confirmed what Kjarr had already recognized. "That belonged to Astrid Ironbrook," Kjarr continued, his voice now carrying the terrible calm that preceded violence. "She was 8 years old, and she wore it because her grandmother had told her it would keep her safe from harm." The bronze medallion seemed to burn in the sunlight, its small surface reflecting not just light, but the growing horror of understanding that was spreading through the crowd. This was not merely evidence of theft, it was proof of participation in something far darker than simple slave trading. Magnus began backing away from Kjarr, his earlier confidence replaced by the survival instincts of someone who suddenly realized he might be standing too close to an explosion. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Kjarr said, his chains clanking ominously as he tested their strength with movements that suggested his earlier submission had been more strategic than genuine. "I'm stating facts. That medallion was taken from a child during the massacre at Ironbrook, which means your guard was among the raiders who destroyed my settlement." The accusation struck the gathered crowd like lightning illuminating a landscape they had never properly seen. Suddenly, Magnus's vague stories about finding Kjarr among ruins took on sinister new meaning. This was not simply a matter of a merchant purchasing merchandise of questionable provenance. This was evidence of direct collaboration with the very criminals who had destroyed an entire community. "You weren't just scavenging among the aftermath," Astrid said, her voice filled with dawning horror. "You were part of the attack itself." Magnus raised his hands in a gesture meant to be placating, but which only emphasized his growing desperation. "That's a serious accusation, requiring serious proof. A piece of jewelry could have come from anywhere, through any number of legitimate channels." "The medallion is unique," Kjarr interrupted, his voice now carrying the authority of someone whose word had once been law in his own domain. "Bronze, mixed with silver in a pattern that was specific to Ironbrook's metalworking traditions. Young Astrid's grandmother had it made by their village smith, using techniques that had been passed down through 5 generations. Eric stepped forward, his professional eye already examining the medallion from a distance. "Show me the piece," he commanded the guard, with the authority of a master craftsman. "If it's as unique as he claims, I'll know its origin within moments." The guard looked desperately toward Magnus, clearly seeking guidance from his employer about how to handle this unexpected exposure. But Magnus was backing away more quickly now, his survival instincts finally overriding his commercial interests. "This is getting out of hand," the trader said, signaling to his remaining men. "We should withdraw and discuss these complications in a more private setting." But withdrawal was no longer an option. The crowd had formed a loose circle around the auction area, not threatening exactly, but certainly not allowing easy escape. More importantly, several of the village's hunters had quietly retrieved bows from their homes, and while no arrows were yet nocked, the implications were clear enough. Elin, still standing beside Kjarr, looked up at the chained giant with worry, clear in her young eyes. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Kjarr's expression softened as he looked down at her, the terrible intensity fading back into something approaching the gentle protector she remembered from the forest. "Now, little, when the truth decides what comes next, and the truth has a way of being stronger than chains." As if responding to his words, the bronze medallion caught the light again, its small surface reflecting not just sunlight, but the dawning recognition that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with swords and axes, but with courage enough to see clearly and act rightly regardless of the personal cost. The bronze medallion seemed to pulse in the sunlight like a heartbeat made visible, its small surface carrying the weight of truth that could no longer be hidden or explained away. Magnus's guard, the lean, scarred man who had remained silent throughout the morning's proceedings, now found himself the unwilling center of attention that he had clearly hoped to avoid. "Remove it," Eric commanded, his blacksmith's voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his instructions followed without question. "Let us examine this evidence properly." The guard's hand hovered over the medallion uncertainly, his eyes darting between his employer and the increasingly hostile crowd. Magnus, meanwhile, had continued his strategic retreat, putting more distance between himself and the growing storm of village anger. "There's no need for dramatics," Magnus called out, though his voice carried less conviction with each passing moment. "Even if the piece proves to be as described, that doesn't necessarily implicate my men in any wrongdoing. Battlefields are chaotic places. Items change hands through many means." But Bjorn stepped forward, with the measured purpose of someone who had reached the end of his patience for comfortable lies. "Then you won't mind if we examine all your men for similar battlefield acquisitions," he said, his weathered hands already reaching for the reluctant guard. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche. As Bjorn's fingers closed around the medallion's chain, the guard panicked. His hand flew to his sword hilt with the practiced speed of someone who had learned to fight. His way out of difficult situations, but he had forgotten that he stood in the shadow of Kjarr the mountain. Even chained and supposedly broken, the giant warrior moved with fluid precision that spoke of decades spent protecting those who could not protect themselves. His massive shoulders rolled forward, his bound hands came up, and suddenly the guard found himself lifted completely off his feet and held suspended in an iron grip that made breathing a luxury rather than a certainty. "Gently, friend," Kjarr said softly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made resistance seem foolish rather than brave. "We're all civilized people here. No need for hasty movements that might be misunderstood." The guard's sword remained half-drawn, frozen in place by the recognition that any aggressive action would result in consequences far more severe than anything a village court might impose. Around them, the crowd had drawn back slightly, awed by this demonstration of why Kjarr had been able to hold off 30 raiders single-handedly. Magnus was now backing toward his remaining wagons with increasing urgency, his merchant's instincts screaming warnings about situations that had spiraled beyond profitable control. "Release my man immediately," he demanded, though his voice carried more desperation than authority. "This is unlawful detention, assault on legitimate merchants. This is justice beginning to awaken," Astrid interrupted, her flour-dusted hands clenched into fists as she stared at the medallion now clearly visible in the sunlight. "And I suspect it's long overdue." Eric examined the bronze piece with professional thoroughness, his experienced eye noting details that confirmed Kjarr's claims. "Ironbrook work, certainly," he announced. "The alloy mixture, the casting technique, the decorative patterns, all consistent with northern mountain traditions. This piece is no battlefield scavenging." But even as the crowd absorbed this confirmation, something else was happening that would transform their understanding of the entire situation. From the direction of Nordmark's main gate came the sound of approaching horses, not the casual pace of traders or travelers, but the urgent rhythm of riders carrying important news. 3 men crested the hill overlooking the village, their horses lathered with sweat and their clothing marked by hard travel. At their head rode a figure that several villagers recognized with surprise, Jarl Eriksson of the Eastern Reaches, A man whose presence in their remote trading post could only mean significant developments. "Magnus the Red-Beard," the Jarl called out as his party approached the market square, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for official pronouncements. "You are commanded to halt all commercial activities and submit yourself for questioning regarding your recent trading activities in the Northern Territories. The arrival of legitimate authority transformed the entire dynamic of what had been happening around the auction block. Magnus, who had been retreating toward his wagons, now found his escape route blocked by men whose authority superseded any commercial considerations. "Jarl Eriksson," Magnus said, attempting to inject his voice with the respectful warmth appropriate for addressing nobility. "What brings you to our humble trading post? Surely there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, the Jarl replied, dismounting with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. His weathered face bore the kind of grim expression that suggested he brought news that no one would welcome. "We've been tracking your movements for 3 weeks, following reports of irregular trading practices and possible collaboration with criminal elements." The Jarl's eyes swept the scene before him, taking in the chained giant, the frightened guard, the angry crowd, and the general atmosphere of moral reckoning that hung over the square like storm clouds. His expression suggested that he was seeing exactly what he had expected to find. "What we discovered in the ruins of Ironbrook was illuminating," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been forced to confront evidence of humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty. 22 dead raiders, yes, but also clear signs that the attack had been coordinated with outside parties who knew the settlement's defenses and the timing of their guardians' patrols. Magnus had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained tan, his rings catching the light as his hands trembled with barely controlled anxiety. "Jarl, surely you don't believe that I would involve myself in such activities? I'm a legitimate merchant with established trade routes and documented transactions, documented with forged papers and sealed with blood money," one of the Jarl's companions interjected. This was a younger man, whose clothing marked him as a scribe or legal official. "We have testimony from 3 surviving raiders who were captured during their retreat. They provided very detailed accounts of how your organization provided intelligence about target settlements in exchange for a share of the profits." The revelations struck the gathered crowd like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything they thought they understood about the morning's events. This was not simply a matter of questionable slave trading or even battlefield scavenging. This was evidence of a systematic operation that preyed upon peaceful communities with the calculated efficiency of wolves culling sheep. Kjarr still held, the trembling guard suspended, but his attention had shifted entirely to the Jarl and his companions. "The other settlements," he said, his voice carrying a new urgency. "How many others?" The Jarl's expression grew even grimmer. 7 that we've confirmed, possibly more. Small communities like Ironbrook, isolated, peaceful, defended by single guardians or small groups of older warriors. The pattern was always the same. Detailed intelligence, followed by overwhelming force, with any survivors sold into slavery through Magnus's network, including their protectors, the scribe added, consulting his notes with professional detachment. The raiders were specifically instructed to capture rather than kill anyone whose size or skills might prove valuable in the slave markets. The mathematical coldness of the operation was staggering in its implications. These were not random raids driven by desperate need or opportunistic violence. They were calculated harvests of human lives, planned with the same methodical precision that farmers used when deciding which fields to reap at optimal profit. Elin, who had been listening with the wide-eyed attention that children brought to adult conversations they didn't fully understand, suddenly stepped forward with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "How many children," she asked, her young voice carrying across the silent square, "how many children like me lost their families to these people?" The Jarl looked down at her with the expression of someone who'd been forced to calculate such numbers and found them almost too heavy to bear. "More than 100 confirmed," he said gently. "Perhaps twice that number when we account for settlements that simply disappeared without any survivors to tell their stories." The weight of those numbers settled over Nordmark like a physical presence, transforming what had begun as a simple commercial transaction into something far more significant. A moment when an entire community was forced to confront the true cost of looking away from inconvenient truths. Magnus made one final desperate attempt to escape the closing net of justice and consequence. "Even if these accusations prove true," he said, his voice cracking with strain, "I am still a legitimate merchant with legal rights and proper documentation. You cannot simply—" "Actually," the Jarl interrupted with quiet satisfaction, "we can. By royal decree, all assets and merchandise associated with your organization are now forfeit to the Crown, pending full investigation of your activities. That includes any slaves currently in your possession." He gestured toward Kjarr with formal authority, "which means this man is no longer your property, Magnus. He is free to go where he chooses, when he chooses, as befits someone who has already paid far more than his share of the price for others' crimes." The words, "free to go," hung in the mountain air like the first notes of a song that everyone recognized, but had forgotten how to sing. Around the market square, faces that had grown accustomed to the careful moral compromises required for survival in harsh times now struggled to process the sudden possibility that justice might actually emerge from chaos. Kjarr slowly lowered the trembling guard back to solid ground, his massive hands releasing their grip with the careful control of someone who understood the difference between necessary force and needless cruelty. The guard stumbled backward, his face pale with the recognition that he had come far closer to death than his employer's promises of easy profit had ever suggested possible. "The chains," Jarl Eriksson said, his voice carrying the formal authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Remove them immediately." But even as the Jarl's scribe began searching Magnus's equipment for the appropriate keys, something was happening that spoke to deeper transformations than simple physical liberation. The crowd of villagers who had gathered to witness a slave auction was slowly reorganizing itself into something that resembled a community, grappling with questions about its own character and values. Bjorn stepped forward, his weathered hands already working at the locks that held Kjarr's wrist shackles. The smith's face bore the concentrated expression of someone whose professional pride had been offended by the crude ironwork of Magnus's restraints. "Shoddy craftsmanship," he muttered, his tools making quick work of mechanisms designed more for intimidation than security. Any decent smith could have picked these locks with a bent nail. As the first set of shackles fell away, Kjarr flexed his hands slowly, wincing slightly as circulation returned to fingers that had been restricted. For months, the marks left by the iron told their own story, raw patches where metal had rubbed against skin, calluses formed by countless attempts to find comfortable positions within uncomfortable constraints. But it was his expression that drew the most attention from the watching villagers. There was relief there, certainly, and gratitude, but also something deeper and more complex. The freedom being offered to him was not simply physical liberation from chains, but something far more significant: the restoration of agency to someone who had sacrificed everything for the protection of others. "Where will you go?" Elin asked, quietly, her small hand still resting on his arm, as if afraid that he might disappear again into the wilderness from which he had originally emerged. "What happens now?" The question carried implications that extended far beyond simple logistics. Kjarr the Mountain had lost everything: his home, his community, his purpose as guardian of people who no longer existed to be protected. He was free, yes, but free to do what? Free to go where? Before Kjarr could respond, Jarl Eriksson cleared his throat with the formal gravity of someone about to make an official pronouncement. "If I may," he said, his voice taking on the ceremonial tone reserved for matters of significant legal consequence. There are certain considerations that bear upon this situation. The Jarl gestured toward Magnus, who was now standing under the watchful eyes of two armed guards with the resigned expression of someone who had finally acknowledged that his profitable criminal enterprise had reached its inevitable conclusion. This man's activities have caused damage that extends far beyond the immediate victims of his raids. Entire communities have been destroyed, families scattered, children orphaned. He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle over the gathered crowd. While we cannot undo the harm that has been done, we can ensure that those responsible face appropriate consequences for their choices. Magnus looked up with the desperate hope of someone who suddenly realized that his situation might still be negotiable. Jarl, surely we can reach some accommodation. I have resources, connections, information that might prove valuable to your investigations. You have nothing that we want, the Jarl replied with cold finality. Nothing except your complete testimony regarding your network of collaborators, and your agreement to make whatever restitution is possible to the survivors of your victims. The trader's shoulders sagged as the last of his illusions about escaping consequences dissolved into the mountain air. Around him, his remaining guards had begun the practical business of surrendering their weapons and preparing for the journey to whatever justice awaited them in the Jarl's stronghold. But even as the immediate drama of Magnus's downfall played out, something else was building in the background. A growing awareness among the villagers that they, too, faced choices about who they wanted to be in the aftermath of this revelation. Astrid the baker stepped forward, her flour-dusted apron somehow lending dignity rather than diminishing it as she addressed Kjarr directly. "You spoke of 50 souls in your settlement," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "What of the survivors? Those you helped escape through the mountain passes?" Kjarr's expression brightened slightly, the first genuine warmth anyone had seen from him since his arrival in chains. "Scattered to relatives and allied communities throughout the northern reaches," he said. "Safe by the grace of the gods, though homeless and grieving." "Not homeless," Freya interjected, with the practical authority of someone who had spent decades organizing community responses to various crises. "Not if people of goodwill choose to offer them sanctuary." Her words hung in the air with the weight of possibility, and several villagers began exchanging glances that suggested wheels were turning in minds, accustomed to solving problems through collective action. Eric the blacksmith nodded slowly, his scarred hands already calculating the logistics of what Freya was suggesting. "Nordmark has grown prosperous through trade," he said thoughtfully. "Perhaps it's time we use that prosperity for something more meaningful than simply accumulating more silver. The children especially," Astrid added, her maternal instincts responding to the image of young ones left parentless by Magnus's crimes. "No child should face winter without a hearth and family to protect them." Elin looked up at these adult conversations with the bright attention of someone who was beginning to understand that she might not be the only orphan whose circumstances were about to change dramatically. "Would they come here?" she asked. "The children from Ironbrook?" "If invited," Kjarr replied, his voice carrying a note of hope that had been absent throughout his months of captivity. "The northern communities have always been bound by ties, stronger than blood, mutual aid, shared responsibility, the understanding that in harsh lands, survival depends on caring for one another." Old Henrik, whose farm had been struggling with the demands of another difficult season, stepped forward with the measured pace of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected not just himself, but the entire community that depended on his harvests. "I have land enough for several families," he said simply. "Good soil, adequate shelter, work enough for those willing to earn their place through honest labor." He paused, studying Kjarr with the careful assessment of someone evaluating a potential neighbor rather than a former slave. "Including work for someone with the skills to help defend what we're building here." The offer hung in the air like sunrise, breaking over mountains, illuminating possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Here was not just charity or temporary assistance, but something far more significant, the invitation to rebuild community from the ruins of tragedy. Bjorn had finished removing the last of Kjarr's chains, the discarded metal lying on the ground like shed skin from some transformative process. The giant warrior stood fully free for the first time in months, his massive frame seeming to expand as the psychological weight of captivity lifted along with its physical constraints. But instead of immediately accepting the generous offers being made, Kjarr turned his attention to something that clearly weighed more heavily on his mind than his own circumstances. His dark eyes sought out Magnus among the growing crowd of prisoners, and when he spoke, his voice carried the formal gravity of someone delivering a judgment rather than making a request. "There will be a reckoning," he said, his words carrying across the square with the finality of stone settling into its proper place, not just for Magnus and his raiders, but for all those who participated in this harvest of innocent lives. The Jarl nodded with grim satisfaction. "Indeed, there will be. The king has authorized me to pursue this investigation wherever it leads, regardless of the status or connections of those involved. And the children," Kjarr continued, his voice taking on the protective intensity that had once made him legendary among the northern settlements. "Those who have already been sold, scattered to buyers throughout the trading networks, what of their fate?" The question struck at the heart of the moral complexity that surrounded situations like this. Justice for the perpetrators was one thing, but recovery of victims who had already disappeared into the vast networks of human commerce was another matter entirely. Far more difficult, far more expensive, and far less certain of success. "We will do what we can," the Jarl promised, though his tone suggested he understood the limitations of what official authority could accomplish in such circumstances. "But much will depend on information, cooperation, and the willingness of communities like this one to provide sanctuary when we do locate survivors." As if responding to the Jarl's words, the bronze medallion that had started this chain of revelations caught the light once more, its small surface reflecting not just sunlight, but the faces of people who were beginning to understand that they stood at a crossroads between complicity and courage. The climax was building not toward violence or dramatic confrontation, but toward something far more significant. A community's decision about what kind of people they wanted to be when faced with the choice between comfortable blindness and the difficult responsibility of doing what was right. The moment of transformation arrived, not with thunder or lightning, but with the quiet certainty of dawn breaking over mountains that had stood witness to countless sunrises. In the center of Nordmark's market square, surrounded by the debris of broken chains and shattered illusions, a community found itself confronting the fundamental question that defines all human societies. What do we owe to one another? And what price are we willing to pay to honor that debt? Kjarr stood in the space where the auction block had commanded attention just hours earlier, but now the focus had shifted from commercial transaction to something far more significant. His massive frame, no longer bowed by captivity, seemed to radiate the kind of quiet strength that comes from surviving the worst that life can offer and emerging with integrity intact. "Before we speak of futures," he said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected entire communities, "there are debts that must be acknowledged and honored." He turned toward Elin, who had remained close to his side throughout the morning's revelations, her small presence somehow anchoring him to the possibility that protection and kindness still mattered in a world that seemed determined to reward cruelty and exploitation. "You risked everything to speak truth when truth was dangerous to tell," he said, lowering himself to one knee so they could speak eye to eye. "That kind of courage deserves recognition and reward." From within his travel-worn clothing, Kjarr withdrew something that caught the sunlight with familiar gleam. A second bronze medallion, similar to the one that had provided such damning evidence against Magnus's guard, but clearly different in its craftsmanship and significance. "This belonged to my sister," he explained, his voice carrying the weight of memory and loss. "She died defending Ironbrook's children when the raiders broke through our outer defenses. She would have wanted it to go to someone who understood the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves." He placed the medallion carefully around Elin's neck, where it settled against her patched tunic like a badge of honor that transformed her from orphan beggar into something approaching nobility. The gesture was simple, but its implications resonated through the watching crowd like ripples spreading across still water. "But protection requires more than courage," Kjarr continued, rising to address the broader community that had gathered around them. "It requires community, cooperation, the willingness of good people to stand together against those who would prey upon the innocent." Jarl Eriksson stepped forward, his official authority lending weight to what was clearly becoming more than a simple expression of gratitude. "The Crown recognizes the debt owed to communities that have suffered under Magnus's predations," he announced. "There will be compensation, silver taken from the traders' confiscated assets, distributed to those who lost family members or property to his network of raiders." But even as he spoke of material restitution, it was clear that something deeper was being negotiated in the space between official justice and community healing. The villagers of Nordmark were grappling with questions that went beyond simple monetary compensation to address fundamental issues of responsibility and redemption. Astrid stepped forward, her baker's apron dusted with flour that somehow lent her words the authority of honest work, honestly done. "Silver is useful," she said practically, "but it cannot replace what was lost or heal what was broken. For that, we need something more substantial than coins." She gestured toward the ruins of Magnus's trading operation, the scattered merchandise, the confused guards, the general wreckage of a criminal enterprise that had finally met its reckoning. "We need commitment. We need the kind of community that makes such exploitation impossible because people care enough to look after one another." Her words struck at the heart of what had made Magnus's operation possible in the first place. Not just the greed of direct participants, but the willingness of otherwise good people to look away from inconvenient truths, as long as those truths didn't directly affect their own comfort and security. Eric the blacksmith nodded with the practical understanding of someone who knew that the strongest iron required both intense heat and careful hammering. "We've grown comfortable with compromises," he admitted, his scarred hands gesturing toward the evidence of what those compromises had cost. "Perhaps it's time we learned to be uncomfortable again, uncomfortable enough to act when action is needed." The crowd murmured agreement, but it was old Henrik who voiced what many were thinking, but few had yet dared to say aloud. "Fine words," he said, his weathered face showing the skepticism of someone who had seen many good intentions founder on the rocks of practical difficulty. "But what does such commitment look like when winter comes and food runs short? What does community mean when helping others requires genuine sacrifice rather than comfortable gestures?" His challenge hung in the mountain air like smoke from a signal fire, calling attention to the gap between noble intentions and sustained action. This was the crucial moment, the point at which communities either recommitted themselves to their deepest values or found convenient reasons to return to previously acceptable compromises. Kjarr looked around the circle of faces, seeing in them the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that he had observed in countless other communities throughout his years. As a guardian and protector, he understood, perhaps better than anyone present, how easily good intentions could be overwhelmed by the daily pressures of survival and self-interest. But he also understood something else, something that his months of captivity and suffering had only reinforced rather than diminished. Sometimes the most important stand a person could make was the one that required everything, while promising nothing except the knowledge that they had chosen courage over comfort when the choice truly mattered. The silence that followed old Henrik's challenge was the kind that carried weight, not empty space, but the pregnant pause before a decision that would define everything that came afterward. Around the market square, faces reflected the internal struggle between the safety of familiar compromises and the demanding uncertainty of genuine moral courage. It was Elin who broke that silence, her young voice cutting through the adult hesitation, with the clarity that sometimes comes from those too young to have learned the careful calculations that paralyze grown minds. "I know what it means," she said, her small hand moving instinctively to touch the bronze medallion that now rested against her chest. "It means when someone needs help, you help them, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something you'd rather keep." She looked up at Kjarr, then around at the assembled villagers, her green eyes bright with the absolute conviction that only children possessed when stating fundamental truths. "It means you don't let bad things happen just because stopping them is difficult or dangerous or expensive." Her words struck the gathering like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of recognition through minds that had grown accustomed to more complex rationalizations for inaction. Here was the moral mathematics of childhood, stripped of adult sophistication and reduced to its essential elements: right versus wrong, help versus abandonment, courage versus comfort. Bjorn felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that came not from his mind, but from someplace deeper, where the values learned at his father's forge still burned with undiminished heat. "The child speaks truth," he said quietly, his weathered hands clenching into fists that had shaped countless pieces of iron into tools for building rather than destroying. "But truth has a price," Orm observed, though his voice carried more sadness than resistance, "and prices must be paid by someone. The question becomes who pays, and how much are we willing to sacrifice for the privilege of sleeping peacefully?" Kjarr stepped forward, his massive presence commanding attention not through intimidation, but through the quiet authority of someone who had already paid every price that courage could demand and emerged somehow unbroken from the experience. "I have seen what happens when good people choose comfort over conscience," he said, his voice carrying the weight of burned settlements and murdered children. "I have stood among the ruins of communities that thought themselves too small to matter, too remote to threaten, too peaceful to attract the attention of those who harvest suffering for profit." He gestured toward Magnus, who stood under guard with the defeated expression of someone whose elaborate justifications had finally collapsed under the weight of exposed truth. "Men like this succeed not because they are strong, but because they understand that most people will choose to look away as long as the violence remains someone else's problem." The words hung in the mountain air like an indictment, challenging every comfortable assumption about the relationship between safety and moral responsibility. Around the square, villagers shifted uncomfortably as they recognized the truth of what Kjarr was describing. The way they had participated in Magnus's system, not through active malice, but through the simple expedient of asking no difficult questions as long as the profits continued to flow. Astrid stepped forward, her baker's practical wisdom cutting through philosophical complexity with the precision of a well-sharpened knife. "Then what do you propose?" she asked. "How does a trading village like Nordmark become the kind of community that prevents rather than enables such exploitation?" The question was direct, practical, demanding specific answers rather than noble generalities. It was the kind of challenge that separated genuine commitment from comfortable rhetoric, and everyone present understood that how they answered it would determine whether this day marked a true transformation or merely another episode of temporarily elevated intentions. Kjarr looked around the circle of faces, seeing in them the same mixture of fear and hope that he had observed in every community that had ever faced the choice between easy compromise and difficult integrity. When he spoke, His voice carried the measured authority of someone who had spent years thinking about such problems and developing practical solutions. "We begin by making it unprofitable," he said simply. "We create networks of communication between communities, sharing information about threats and suspicious activities. We establish protocols for mutual aid and defense that make isolated settlements harder to target. We refuse to do business with anyone whose profits depend on others' suffering." He paused, allowing the practical implications of his words to settle over the gathered crowd. "And we make it clear that anyone who preys upon the innocent will face not just individual resistance, but organized, sustained opposition from every community that values protection over profit." The vision he outlined was ambitious, demanding, and certain to require sacrifices from everyone involved. But it was also something more important than ambition. It was achievable, provided people were willing to choose long-term security over short-term convenience. Jarl Eriksson nodded with the satisfaction of someone who recognized genuine leadership. When he encountered it, "The Crown would support such efforts," he said formally, "both through official resources and by ensuring that communities committed to mutual protection receive priority consideration for trade agreements and royal favor." The offer of official backing transformed Kjarr's vision from idealistic hope into practical possibility, creating a framework within which moral courage could be expressed through concrete action rather than comfortable sentiment. Around the square, faces that had been marked by uncertainty began to show something different, not naive optimism, but the careful hope that comes from recognizing that difficult problems might actually have workable solutions if people were willing to pay the necessary price. 6 months later, as the first green shoots of spring began to push through the mountain snow, Nordmark bore little resemblance to the village that had gathered around Magnus's auction block on that transformative autumn day. The changes were subtle at first glance. An additional workshop here, expanded housing there, new faces among the familiar ones, but they spoke to deeper transformations that had reshaped the community's understanding of itself and its place. In the larger world, Elin stood on the hill overlooking the valley, her wild hair now neatly braided and her patched clothing replaced by the practical wool garments appropriate to her new status as Henrik's adopted daughter. The bronze medallion still rested against her chest, but it was no longer the only treasure she carried. Around her neck hung a second chain, this one bearing a small iron key that Bjorn had forged, especially for her, symbolizing her role as keeper of the community's memory and conscience. "They're coming," she called down to the figures working in the expanded settlement below. Her sharp eyes had spotted the distant dust cloud that marked the approach of the monthly caravan. Not traders seeking to exploit isolated communities, but representatives of the network that Kjarr had envisioned and helped create. The response to her announcement was immediate and coordinated. Children ran to fetch adults, workshops began shutting down for the day, and the great bell that Henrik had commissioned began tolling the welcome that brought everyone together for news, trade, and the strengthening of bonds that held their alliance together. Kjarr emerged from the new longhouse that served as both community center and defensive headquarters, his massive frame moving with the easy confidence of someone who had found his proper place in the world. The months of good food and purposeful work had filled out his frame, and the haunted look that had marked his time in captivity had been replaced by something approaching contentment. But it was not the contentment of someone who had retired from life's struggles. Rather, it was the satisfaction of someone who had found work worthy of his skills and values, the daily labor of building something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. "Any word from the northern settlements?" he asked as Ellen joined him at the longhouse entrance, her quick steps easily keeping pace with his longer stride. 3 more communities have agreed to join the network," she reported with the efficiency of someone who had become expert at processing and organizing information. That makes 17 in total, with 5 more considering formal alliance once. They've seen how well the system works through another full season. The numbers represented more than administrative success. They spoke to the gradual spread of hope through regions that had grown accustomed to isolation and vulnerability. Each new community that joined their network represented families that would sleep more peacefully, children who would grow up in greater safety, and guardians who no longer faced overwhelming odds alone. As the caravan crested the final hill and began its descent toward Nordmark's expanded boundaries, Elin could see familiar faces among the riders. There was Astrid Ironbrook, not the child whose medallion had provided evidence of Magnus's crimes, but her older sister, one of the survivors who had found sanctuary in Nordmark and grown into a respected member of their community. Behind her rode representatives from communities throughout the northern reaches, their presence testament to the network's growing strength and coordination. But it was the figure at the rear of the caravan that drew Elin's particular attention. A small, carefully guarded wagon that carried precious cargo indeed. How many this time? Kjarr asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Would bring both joy and sorrow in equal measure. 7, Elin replied, her voice soft with the complex emotions that always accompanied these rescues. Children who were sold into slavery and have now been recovered through the network's investigation efforts. Each rescue represented a victory against the kind of exploitation that Magnus had practiced, but also a reminder of how many more remained lost in the vast networks of human commerce that stretched across the known world. They celebrated what they could save, while acknowledging the limits of what even organized, committed communities could accomplish. The caravan's arrival brought the usual mixture of celebration and solemnity that marked these gatherings. News was shared, trade conducted, and plans made for continued cooperation. But the true significance of the moment lay not in any single transaction or announcement, but in the simple fact that such gatherings had become routine, evidence of communities that had chosen connection over isolation, mutual aid over individual survival. As evening settled over the valley and the visiting representatives gathered around the Longhouse's great hearth, Elin found herself thinking about the question that had driven her to speak out on that distant autumn day. What transforms a village's greatest fear into their most unlikely protector? The answer, she had learned, was simpler and more complex than she had imagined. It required nothing more than the courage to see clearly and the willingness to act on what you saw. But it also demanded the kind of sustained commitment that could survive setbacks, disappointments, and the daily temptation to choose comfort over conscience. Kjarr settled beside her on the bench outside the longhouse, his presence as reassuring as it had been that day in the forest when he had stepped between her and the wolves. Around them, the sounds of community life continued. Children playing, adults discussing the day's work, the gentle laughter that comes from people who feel safe enough to express joy. Do you ever wonder, Elin asked quietly, what would have happened if I hadn't spoken that day? Kjarr considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had made him such an effective guardian and leader. Every community faces such moments, he said finally. Times when the choice between right and wrong becomes clear, and people must decide who they want to be. He gestured toward the lights of Nordmark spread below them, each window representing a family that had chosen to be part of something larger and more meaningful than individual survival. You didn't create the choice, little sister. You simply had the courage to name it clearly enough that others could see it too. The bronze medallion caught the firelight as Elin nodded, understanding that the true legacy of that autumn day lay not in any single rescue or transformation, but in the ongoing commitment to choose courage over comfort whenever such choices presented themselves. Sometimes the smallest voices do indeed carry the greatest truths, and sometimes, when those truths are spoken with sufficient courage and clarity, they create echoes that resonate far beyond their humble origins, transforming not just individual lives, but entire communities and perhaps eventually the world itself.